Welcome to the EMSDC MBEIC webinar. I'm Joel Burstein, founder of Keep It Simple Training Development. We specialize in sales, management, customer service, consulting, and training. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the MBEIC, it stands for the MBE Input Committee. And today I'm joined by my two fellow MBEIC committee members and Eastern Minority Supplier Development Council board members, Reshma Murthy and Paul Douglas. Reshma is the president and CEO of Frontier Technologies, with the overall responsibility for the strategic direction, vision, values, and goals of the organization. She's driven with the purpose of customer value through tech innovation, as well as revolutionary and disruptive innovation. Paul is the president of the JPI Group. Their organization strives daily to make the lives better for the partners they work with, the clients they support, and the communities they serve. JPI specializes in helping clients develop customized recruiting solutions to help attract and retain the key talent you need. In addition to our board members, we are honored to have a very special guest today, Kimberly Prescott, who is the founder and president of Prescott HR, an outsourced human relations consulting firm. Prescott HR assists clients with developing a strong internal management and human resource structure during periods of organizational change and/or rapid growth. The team at Prescott HR also creates and defines HR departments and practices from the ground up. So let me share a little history as to what got us hosting a webinar today. At the beginning of COVID, we realized that we were up against something a bit unique and that we needed to really support each other to get through this. So this group sort of started having regular conversations to support each other. As we worked through a lot of our challenges, we realized that we wanted to share some of our experiences with our fellow EMSDC members and invite subject matter experts like Kimberly to our webinar. So we decided to create this and share it with all of you. So we appreciate you making some time today. So before we jump in, let me cover a few quick housekeeping items. This will be recorded and we will share it afterward if you'd like to pick up or rewatch it. Save your questions for the end. We'll have a Q&A then. And feel free to type your questions in the chat. And with that, let's get started. So let me start with you, Paul. You lead a large staff. In your experience, why has HR been such an important piece of your success?
I'm going to be honest from the gate, Joel. I think we all grew up in corporate America, honestly, maybe having a negative perception sometimes of HR. Like I was in sales, so HR was AKA sales prevention, right? So we all know how that can go. However, once I transitioned into the entrepreneurial world, talking to my mentors, looking at other companies that are in the same space that we were in, large, growing and scaling, they had an HR team. Either they had an HR consultant or they had an HR team. And I realized very quickly, if we don't put something in place, we could struggle. So we've engaged, actually, Kimberly for the past almost 18 months. She may feel it's been longer, right? Over the last 18 months. And it's been significantly valuable for our organization. I'll walk you through a couple of scenarios that I think has been key for us to help us grow. One is aligning to our strategy, right? One of the biggest things that I said from day one with myself and our leadership team is we want to grow and scale nationwide. But I didn't consider nationwide means putting employees in New York and California, and there's certain laws and compliance and tax laws that I didn't consider with pricing, with rates. Those things were top of mind, right? So having an HR person there to put that top of mind for us with our billing and our invoice and our onboarding was key. Second, we started off as a family-owned company, which we still are, and we still have a lot of husbands and wives and sisters and brothers. That can cause issues if you want to guess, right? So having someone to come in from the outside to say, hey, if you don't put these things in place from a compliance purpose standpoint, you could struggle, right? And we have struggled, but having those things in place have been ultra beneficial for us. And then last but not least, I would say being able to get ahead of not employee issues, but employee relations, right? There are things that we hire consultants across the country. And my biggest fear, knock on wood, is something could happen, right? And we need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and putting things in place that can protect us, protect our clients, and also protect our consultants. So those three things have been key for us. And I don't think without having an HR person in our corner, I don't think we would have gotten to the point we are today.
You're so right about how, we think of HR, especially those of us in sales. You're absolutely right. And all that's valuable as we grow, right? So Reshma, same thing for you. I mean, you have a staff as well. I mean, in your experience, how's HR helped you guys be successful?
Well, I want to comment first. Like I know Paul said, a lot of people come from corporate. I actually came right out of college and right into the business. So for me, my experience is a little different. So I don't have that experience with a corporate HR. So a lot of the rules and things that I had to do along the way were a lot of stumbling blocks, right? And again, we always follow the rules. There were no issues, but understanding the nuances, I think were really important. And that's why we had to get involved with, and I just met Kimberly today, but the other HR company that we were working with and that we consult with, because there are a lot of things like Paul was saying, you have to worry about the taxes and the laws and the labor laws in all the different states, depending on where your employees reside. And then, so that was really critical. And not even that, just understanding just even the basics of stuff, right? Your exempt, non-exempt employees and who falls into those categories were really important for us to understand. And again, because we started out as such a small company, and now as we've grown over the past 15 years, it's become more imperative for us to understand those different issues. And then now I can say that I'm glad that I have outsourced that HR arm to the outside the company, but it also brought in an HR expert on my team too. So with both of their guidance, we've been able to really just adhere to the rules, understand what's needed, and stick with it. But now through this conversation we're having today, it's a lot. What do you do with COVID, and how do you handle your employees that are working remotely? We're a technology company, so a lot of my employees work remotely. In my office, we all meet maybe once a week to go over just key items, and then we're all out. So that's brought another different challenge to the equation. And so again, it's hard, and I'm sure Kim, you're going to talk about it more today, but for us, it's just been a challenge in terms of how do you make everybody happy while still complying with the rules? So,
Well, I think we both made a really good point, right? I mean, I think HR is much bigger, broader than we probably give it credit for at face value, right? We don't realize all of the ways that it impacts. And you talk about crossing state lines. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, it's more than just hiring and firing, right? There's just a whole lot more to it. And I think that's a big reason why we're here. And so what's fascinating about this is, as we started to prep for this, right, we were able to identify that if you do your HR properly, it actually can add some profit to your business. It can add value, it can make your life easier. I mean, hey, just taking some things off the plate of a CEO or an owner gives me the opportunity to go spend my time in a more valuable way. And so, Kimberly, let me turn it over to you. I mean, why is there this stigma around HR, and why is that really the wrong way to view this?
Yeah, it's so funny that Paul said that HR was known as the sales prevention department, because I actually had that written down on my notes, because he and I previously worked at that same company where HR was called the sales prevention department. So it's real. But unfortunately, in many organizations, HR is positioned as the police. So you're brought in when there's a problem. You're brought in only to terminate someone. And so what it does is it creates a situation where people don't feel comfortable coming to HR. And the reality is that HR should be a neutral party. We're there to manage risk for the organization and to help the organization make the right decisions as it relates to people. So it's not an advocate for the employees or an advocate for the business. It's risk management. It's advice and counsel. And so when used properly, we provide advice and counsel to managers, because at the end of the day, if I do the termination, who's the escalation point? Did I hire that person? Did I set expectations for that person? No, I did not. Okay. So ultimately, I can facilitate that conversation. But if I'm positioned in a way where I'm only brought in with the axe, people aren't going to come to me. And then as a business, you are less likely to be able to proactively get in front of issues because people sit on them. They don't come to HR, and if you're the problem manager, they're definitely not coming to you. I think that's why it's problematic. And I think it's important for business owners to understand how to utilize an HR resource, because if you really only use them in that way, you are underutilizing that resource. Just like you said, Joel, there are so many things that if used properly, HR can do to enhance the business and quite honestly bring value to the organization and not just be an overhead.
Yeah, and what's funny about being an entrepreneur or owning a business or starting a business is really inherently about taking risk. And I think sometimes people forget that, right? That we end up taking a tremendous amount of risk naturally. What's interesting about what you said is, and when I coach people, I tell them it's not about avoiding risk, it's about managing risk. And I think the way that you said that is really critical. This is another tool that owners should be leveraging to manage their risk. There's all types of risk that we face as owners in businesses, and this is a great, you're right, managing risk is critical to our success. So let me switch gears a bit on this one. Let's talk about culture, because I know this was a big thing that you brought up when we were prepping for some of this. And two sort of questions. Why does culture play a role, right, in today's challenges, both with our hybrid working models and with dealing with COVID in general? And how do we create a culture where employees feel safe, right?
Well, you can start, Paul.
I was going to say, one thing I wanted to echo that you mentioned, Kimberly, that I think that's key is I think certain categories fall into a delayed engagement. What I mean by that is people tend to engage HR and marketing last as a company, right? However, those two can sometimes be your strongest allies that can bring the most value to your company. And you almost bring it in when you have to. Right. So it's like anything else. When you bring it in when you have to and you need it, that's not the best time to do so. So I wanted to echo that. I think that's a lesson that I've learned is bringing someone in, again, HR, marketing, some of those key infrastructure ahead of time can save you a significant amount of time. For the culture piece, Joel, that's a big one for me. Like I've grown up in companies where culture is at the staple of what we do because we place consultants. We deal with people all day. And I'll start with one thing that's always been key for us is a vulnerability-based trust, right? Like as an organization, you brought up being safe. If you can't create trust within your company, it's difficult to create any kind of culture. What makes it more difficult? Being virtual, right? So it's already difficult to create trust in an office when you sit next to someone, which is a little easier, right? I sit next to Joel, sit next to Rashford, we can talk, we can hang out. But if we're all virtual, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So I'll give you guys some examples of maybe what we've learned along the way. All right, number one is you have to be deliberate with creating your culture. I think sometimes we sit back and we assume that the culture will create itself and it doesn't, right? You have to really define what's important for you, what's important for your team, and what core values you need. That ties back to HR because you may have some core values that may not be legal, right? Keep that in mind. You may say, I want folks to do X, it may not be the right thing. So making sure that your culture and your core values are also compliant and setting that stage, I think that's one of the most important things to do as a company because a lot of things can fall through the cracks on the back end. And it's tough to hire and fire without those core values. Because next thing you know, you're just making sometimes a rational decision and your team will realize it. So that's been my experience with culture is having it in place and then tying it to HR and then using that to make sure you hire, manage, let go of folks that don't fit into that culture.
It's a good point. Kimberly, what are your thoughts around culture?
Yeah, I agree. And I like what Paul said is that you have to be intentional about your culture because there are many people who actually confuse culture with core values. Core values are things that you write down. Now, hopefully you live them. Hopefully you do what you're supposed to do with them. But culture is the personality of your organization. It's the actual experience that people have there, which is not something that you can just write down, okay? And so that's why it's important to make sure that everything is in alignment. So if you want to have a culture that is employee-centric, then of course, every activity, everything that you do needs to be tied to that. So you have to think about what is the candidate experience? What is the onboarding experience? How are my policies written? If your handbook is, it sounds punitive and all the language in your handbook is, well, if you do this, then we'll do that. And it's not welcoming and it's not open, then that's not in alignment with your culture. So you just want to really think about how important it is to have all of your activities, policies, processes, systems, everything in alignment with your culture. And so that's where someone that is an HR professional can really help you to break those things down and help you to understand how an employee would experience this, whether or not it's something that could cause some issues when we start to talk about cultural fit. You know, what does that mean in certain organizations? It can have a connotation that we don't want it to have. So really, what is that? And so I think that HR plays a huge role in working with leadership. And I think that's also important to note that HR should be a part of your leadership team. HR should not just be an administrative cost center where paperwork gets processed. If you, particularly in a small organization, if you leverage an HR professional and they work with you in the leadership team, then that's how you can get these things accomplished.
So culture is a big deal, and the alignment's a really interesting piece, right? And it's not something that you can just all of a sudden turn on and turn off, right? If you'd missed it, you're probably going to need some ramp up time to get back in alignment, which sort of brings up where we are today, right? I think we're struggling with COVID. We're struggling with hybrid models. If you've had a hybrid model, Paul, Raish, if you guys have had people, it's not as much of a lift. But if you didn't, Kimberly, if you didn't have that hybrid model existing, and your corporate culture may not be set up for that, what should you do today? I mean, how do you manage these challenges?
Well, what I will say is this. I like to think about culture similar to going to a Starbucks. You can go to a Starbucks in Atlanta. You can go to a Starbucks in, DC. You go to a Starbucks, hopefully you'll have a similar experience. Your drink will be the same. They're going to welcome you. They're going to write your name on your cup. Hopefully they'll pronounce it correctly. And then, it'll be, a great and consistent experience. What we can take from that is it's the consistency of the processes, right? And so whether you're remote, whether you're all in one place or not, it's about having clear expectations, clearly communicating them, and having processes that are documented that you can replicate. That's how you can create a culture, whether you're dispersed or not. I mean, Paul and I came from an organization where there were offices all over the country, but if you walked into one office, they were having this meeting at this time, it was called the same thing, everybody was set up the same, bullpen, office looked the same. You close your eyes and walk into another location because they had systems that were replicated. And so you had a similar experience in every location that you went to. And that's how you can create culture, particularly in this type of an environment. So while it's great for us to sit together and it adds some additional texture to the experience of being an employee, you can do it, but it is a heavy lift on the leadership team, and it absolutely has to be intentional.
Can I add one thing to that? I think Kimberly made a great point. Sometimes we think culture is about more of the fluff, like the core values and having fun and the personality. It's probably just as critical with the compliance and the documentation, right? It's like, hey, what should be done, right? What meetings should be had at what time? What's our PIP process? When do people get written out? Like those things, that's what allows you to be consistent. And those are the things that we've learned along the way, and we're still learning. Is I think we have a great culture, but I think our next step as a company is just to get better at SOPs and compliance and processes, because that's what creates consistency if you want to grow and scale. So I think sometimes we're missing the compliance piece of culture. It doesn't sound as if they go hand in hand, but they are pretty consistent.
I think what's interesting about culture is when I used to work in corporate America, I had a number of people that worked with me, when I was, and I can't say we did it properly, but my vision and what I thought as a leader the corporate culture was, and potentially what my employees interpreted the corporate culture, were not always in alignment, right? And so I think it's important that we have someone else on the outside going, hey, Joel, it's not what you think it is. And candidly, employees aren't always apt to jumping up and telling their supervisor, their boss, or the CEO of a company like, hey, we don't think what you think, right? So I think it's critical that we engage others to really understand this, to make sure that we are doing what we really think we are, right? And that discrepancy can be a bit of a challenge. Rachel, I have a question for you. How do you maintain your corporate culture?
Yeah, and I was going to talk about that too. So I think what Kimberly and Paul and even yourself have discussed are all valid points. I think our take, and we've actually taken some time through COVID to really reevaluate, what is our purpose? What is our mission statement? Because if it's not inspirational from the top, then it's not going to fall down to your employees. So we did take a lot of time, and probably too much time than I wanted, to really craft it out. And then I also, it might be a little different from what Kimberly and Paul are saying, is I actually really feel that the core values of what we're looking for in an employees really does define, or it aligns up closely with our culture. So for us, when we're looking at the hiring process and the people that we want to bring on board, there's those key core things that we're looking for that we know that we need, because we are a small business in terms of people. Those things are pivotal, because if these individuals that we're bringing on don't have these core values aligned with their work ethic, then it's not going to fit with the corporate culture of the team. Because our corporate culture is a very open, fun environment, and it's a constructive workspace for everyone. But everybody has to be able to manage multiple responsibilities, and they need to speak up when something's too much or when they're not getting enough. And if those values aren't in there with you, it's going to be really hard to gel with our team. And so that's something that I convey from the beginning during the hiring process, of what Paul was alluding to. And it's communicated from the start, because if that's not there, then they're not going to gel with the culture. So that's how we kind of approach that.
And I agree with that. I do believe, I was just going to say that I do believe that the core values, if individuals personify the core values, then it will facilitate the culture, right? And it will help to make sure that you're hiring people to your culture. But I do think that sometimes people just stop with core values and don't look at how all of the things that you weave in together, with core values being one of them, actually creates the culture. But I absolutely agree. Competencies that align with, when people have competencies that will help them exhibit the core values, undoubtedly it contributes to the culture, for sure.
Yep.
Paul, any comments on maintaining your corporate culture?
I would like to tie this back to performance, right? Because I think back to what's important for us is, as a business, you want to make sure that you can drive revenue and drive profitability. And in order to do so, whether you want to or not, you still need to have a performance-driven culture, right? And what does that look like? So I think the other piece of culture to me is making sure that expectations are set on what good looks like, because sometimes when it comes time to let go of someone, their expectations are different from your expectation, right? So how do you make sure that you can close that gap early and keep that message clear and consistent throughout the entire process? So that to me is the other piece. I think the performance side is critical. And again, one thing that we've learned over the years, I'm trying to share some mistakes, is being clear with what the minimum performance level should be, right? And then making sure that another gap for us is when they're not meeting it, is it documented, right? Are they clear that, hey, if we don't get here, we're going to be terminated, or, hey, how can we help you to get to the next level? So those, and I think every company struggles there, because if you look at any organization, you have people that are doing well, you have people that are struggling. Where I see the gap is the ones that are struggling, what's the process? Sometimes we just say they're struggling, right? But there's nothing in place to get them to their next level. And of course, the ones that are doing well, sometimes we tend to forget about them, right? What's the next level for them? So those are part of the culture piece I wanted to tie into performance, because that ties right back to revenue and profitability and having a successful company.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would agree with you. A lot of times what we see is even if they're doing certain things right, they're lacking their level of accountability on the back end of it, right? And so if you're setting up culture, if you're setting up performance driven, if you're setting up all of these things, sometimes there's no culture around accountability, right? There is, right? So we've done the hard work and we've set up the structure, and then we don't enforce it, right? We don't continue to make that a priority, right? We let things slide, or we have maybe team members, the managers or whatever in between, that are not, really enforcing it. And so I think there's a lot to what you said, Paul. I mean, it is holding some people's feet to the fire sometimes. And what's interesting about culture is, a lot of times we coach people that sometimes letting a bad employee stay absolutely affects your culture in ways you're not realizing. So you think you're doing the right thing for this individual, but you don't realize, because the other 8 people that are seeing this are being affected by the culture, and they're questioning whether this is really what it's supposed to be. So I think there's a lot of impact here. Anybody else want to add anything as we talk through this?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you just said, Joel, that if you do not create a culture of accountability, the unintended consequence is that you create another culture or a subculture, and that can be right underneath the surface. And sometimes managers or business owners can't put their finger on it. But when you are not properly managing or holding people accountable, that work falls to someone else. And that then becomes, another challenge that you're having. And so again, that goes back to culture is not what you write on paper. It goes back to culture is the experience that people have there. So if I am experiencing that, some people can, come to work and get a check and they don't have to do what they're supposed to do, then it starts to, if depending on the type of person I am, I can say, well, then I'm just going to come to work and do 50%. Or if I want to be in an environment where everyone is excellent and I want, or is striving for excellence, and I want to be in a performance driven environment, then I'm going to say, this isn't the place for me. So definitely the consequences are there.
Yeah, and I think it's not a static process either, right? Like this is iterative to some degree. It's or evolutionary, right? As your organization grows, things have to change, right? It's we talk about it from a business standpoint, right? How a small business can be significantly more nimble and make pivots much faster than larger organizations. Well, as you grow from 10 employees to 100, we need people like you, Kimberly. We need somebody to help us reevaluate where we're at because things will change as they should, right? So let's turn a little bit to what's going on in the world today. We have the hybrid working models, right? So Kimberly, what are some of the current challenges that business owners are facing with making decisions around the hybrid models and how we should, the future of work, really?
Yeah, I think one of them we've kind of talked about is how is it going to impact my culture? Can I create a culture in a hybrid work environment? But I don't think the question is really, can I create a culture in a hybrid work environment? The answer to that is yes, it's do I want to, right? Do I want to create that? And I also think that shifting to remote and hybrid has required organizations to really look at their systems and their processes in a way that they haven't had to do it before, because many organizations were using FaceTime, and not the app on your phone, but FaceTime to determine whether or not someone was successful. Like they come to work every day and they work 8 hours, so they're not a bad employee. Now organizations are really having to use metrics and data to measure performance, to measure whether or not someone is actually, affecting the organization positively. And so that's one of the challenges that I've seen organizations struggle with, is that they don't know how to do that. They don't know how to quantify someone's contribution to the organization because they haven't done it before. They just look at whether or not the person comes to work. So that's something that I think has been a challenge. I think the other challenge is that some organizations realize that they can do more with less, and they don't know how to make the decision about how to restructure their organization to reflect what they really need now that they're in this new environment. Because I think particularly for smaller businesses, we get attached to people. And that's great. It's great to like the people who are in your organization. But ultimately, I'm probably the most untraditional HR person there is, because I really do think about the bottom line. So ultimately, I'm like, we got a business to run, okay? And if we only need, 10 FTEs and we have 12, we have a decision we need to make. So I think that, there are some organizations that are struggling with that piece as well.
Yeah, that makes a tremendous amount of sense. Paul, Reshma, you guys have been doing this for some time. You have some folks that are working remotely. What are your current challenges? Any ideas? What's worked for you?
All right. Well, the only thing I'll continue to echo, because I think most companies struggle here, is just the performance side, right? Because when they're in the office, it's much easier, right? To say, hey, they're doing their job. You can see them going back and forth. But once they're remote or virtual, there needs to be a little bit more clarity on what does good look like for that day. Right? What's the result? What's the performance metrics that should be in place? And I think that's where a lot of companies are struggling. I have a lot of friends that say, hey, I can get the job done in half the day. And I'm like, well, do you go talk to your manager? Do you ask for more? Like all those things are on the plate. Or someone says, hey, I'm working, some people are working more now because they have more time on their hands. So they're working 15, 16 hours a day. I'm like, that's not good either. So I think the communication aspect is key, like almost doing a hard stop and saying, hey, let's evaluate what our team's doing, right? What does good look like? Because the job is different now that they're home and they're virtual. So I think that that's something we've had to consistently do. And for some of the positions we have, it's either I've had to take um, either responsibilities away in some instance, and other instances I realized that, hey, they need more responsibility because the job can be done quicker, more efficiently. So I think that's something to keep top of mind as a business owner, as a leader in your organization.
Yeah,
I echo and agree with what, Kimberly and Paul have said. I think it's really important from a communication perspective for us with the hybrid model. I've made it really clear, and right now I'm still really the key point for all my employees right now. And I've really made it clear where we follow a lot of traction. And I don't know if you all read Traction and the EOS model and the quarterly rocks, and we said all those different things. And so I really stick to them. And so when we have different retreats, we're following it, we're following the agenda, we're putting our rocks together. And then I go back and then we circle back on these things. And then similarly, I make sure that all the team understands what's expected of them. And then the lines of communication are open. Where are you with this and why or why not? So we understand what those challenges are. And so I think this is probably one of the most exhausting parts about being a CEO and a leader for a company is until you're really able to build out your infrastructure in terms of people or enabling different technology processes to move things along faster, it still requires a lot of time from you as an owner. And I think that's really hard. And again, that's where it's really important, where I think you understand your HR rules, because you still have to understand the relationships. And what Kimberly was saying was your bottom line. At the end of the day, you can become best friends with these people, but if they're not doing the things that are going to contribute to your bottom line, then you have to have those hard conversations. And so I make sure that all that is communicated up front. So when that end comes and we know, okay, this isn't going to work because of A, B, and C, then it's clearly outlined and put out there in the universe. So it makes your letting go processes easier. So that's what we do internally, and that's what I'm doing right now.
What's interesting is employees are adjusting both ways. I think you all kind of alluded to some of this, right? There's adjusting down that now they're having to work from home, so maybe they're not doing as much, or they're not as efficient. And then you have the people that are now working from home that are probably working too much, that are not. We were just joking about it, right? Like, I still do this. I still schedule meetings back to back because I'm not moving, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, we would have never done that in another world. Can you imagine just putting 5 or 6 meetings? You'd have been like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, but I think it really has changed and shifted how we work. And candidly, it's been a year. And I'm not sure we've all shifted properly, right? I mean, have you guys seen this in your world, that there are some employees that are still struggling to adjust? How are you helping them adjust to this stuff? I mean, to your point, Paul, I think you mentioned, like, maybe working 15 hours is too much, right? What do y'all think?
I think it's still the communication factor, and that's just
Yeah.
my 2 cents in terms of you have to have your touch points and clear understanding of what's expected and not expected, whether you're in person at the office or remote working. And it's constant communication like this, what we're doing. And hey, we've been, us 3 have been doing that for a year now, just connecting. And that's important. But for me, I feel that it's a communication where I am asking the employees to come in at least once or twice a week to meet with me. And I'm putting in that effort as well, because no matter how remote you are, you still need that communication face to face. There's something about talking to someone face to face. It makes everything. It kind of solves your problems. It solves that anxieties that you feel about this person. And so that's what, again, I think is really important for us. And that's how I enforce it at our company.
So another question for you. Let's think about the COVID, right, for a second. I know we talked a little bit about COVID and how, we're having to make HR decisions now based on the vaccine, right? How, Kimberly, in your opinion, how should business owners be handling or thinking about the vaccine in regards to their employees?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question.
It is. Totally is.
I would say in this instance, I'll have to give an HR answer. Unless you have a need to know, unless you work in an environment that is regulated and would require a vaccine, I don't necessarily know that it's a question that you need to ask or something that you need to focus on. Your responsibility as an employer is to create a safe working environment. And right now, the CDC has given us guidelines around what that looks like. And it doesn't necessarily include everybody in your workplace getting vaccinated or you asking people if they've been vaccinated or if they plan to get vaccinated. It is social distancing and masks. And right now, that's what the protocol is. So unless you are in an environment that requires it, you could be opening a bit of a Pandora's box. Can you say, yes, I want everybody in my workplace to get vaccinated? You absolutely can. But what are you going to do if somebody says that they're not? And so why put something in place if you're not going to do something about it? And if you are, how are you going to manage those exceptions? So there's ADA exceptions, there's religious exceptions. So this is definitely, I would say, a bit of a Pandora's box for employers, particularly small employers. And if you do not have a need to do it, just ask yourself, why? Why am I doing it?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you think about the J&J news today, right? Can you imagine if you were the employer who insisted that your employees get vaccinated and then, you potentially have some of these unforeseen challenges? I would imagine that would come down to managing your risk, which is really the answer you just gave. You don't need to, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
go ahead, Paul. I look like you were going to say something.
I won't give I'll probably try to stay HR PC here as well. I will say this: we've had a couple of folks on our team that has they have gone through, have either had COVID or their parents or family. We've just tried to be as accommodating as possible, right? So our philosophy has been like, hey, if something happens, let us know, right? And we'll try to do our best to support you and your family. That's part of our culture. Like, we're kind of a family-driven organization, so we've applied that same philosophy to the COVID situation. It's like, hey, let us know where you need help, how we can support you. And we've had some folks that have had it and they're still struggling, and some folks that had it and came back to work, right? And so it's been we've left it open, but we've also, as Kimberly said, I haven't dug in. We don't ask. We just tell people to let us know how they feel and then keep us updated, and we'll support them where we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that PC enough from an HR standpoint?
That was great. That was great.
Well done, Paul. Well done. No, it's funny, go ahead, Rachel. Were you going to add something?
I was going to say, for us, it's very similar. Everybody, it's interesting that a majority of our team has been vaccinated, but maybe one or two other people, but they're the ones bringing it up. I don't bring it up when we're in those situations where we're meeting, very similar to what Paul said. Some are okay. We don't everybody just stipulates when we walk into a room what their comfort level is, and then everybody pretty much respects it. So it has not been an issue, but my team is very small, like I said, so it's hasn't been an issue for us.
One thing I will say, and then I'll stop being like all HRE. It is great to be accommodating. It is great to do all of those things, but keep in mind that whatever you do in this COVID situation and the decisions that you make in this COVID situation will apply to everything. It's going to apply to a cold. It's going to apply to the flu. Anything that you make a decision about, you are creating a precedent on how you're going to handle situations and accommodating people in the future. So I will just say, as I say all the time, no good deed goes unpunished. So just be very mindful about the precedent that you set right now, because while you may feel that it is goodwill, I promise you, your employees either think they know or know the law better than you do, okay? And they will come back and say, well, remember when it's the same thing as this, and the ADA says, and then you now have created a precedent. So that's what I'll say, and then I'll stop being HR.
No, that's a really good point, though. But and from an HR perspective in general, not just this, I think there's a lot of truth to creating a precedent, around how you handle a lot of things. And I think that goes back to the culture, which is really where we started. I mean, what's funny about this for everybody out there is when we started this conversation, it was around some of the HR challenges that we're facing in today's world. And what this group led by Kimberly really thought about was that culture really plays a major role in how we solve all of these challenges. And if we build the right culture, potentially these challenges become so easier to find solutions to, right? Is that fair, Kimberly? Like, I mean, that's really what we're saying here is if we have a better culture, we can find solutions to even some of these very difficult challenges.
Yes, as well as clear expectations and accountability. Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think something to consider that I mean, business is nothing more than strategy, people, and process, right? And if you want to kind of scale it down, and the majority, I think, of the issues we tend to have is we're people, we're human, right? And I think if you can solve the people issues, you solve a lot of your issues, right? Because strategy is, we all have a great strategy, right? No one will get in business with a bad strategy, right? So we all have a great
Well,
strategy.
yes, they will. Yeah, they will.
You mean,
Sorry.
majority. But I think it's the people issues. When I talk to other counterparts and my friends in the same space or other owners, it's like we always complain about performance and culture. They're not a good fit. We hired someone. So if we can solve, Elon Musk had a great quote. He goes, as a leader, your main job is to each day, you should be solving the biggest issues, people issues in your company, because that's what will drive you forward. So if you're looking for people issues without HR, now that's an issue. And so you should be looking to solve those people issues with some level of HR compliance and protocol and knowledge tied to it. So I think that's the piece. That's what I've learned along the way is you should always be looking for that. There's always 5+ issues, 10, depending on how big your team is. And if you can attack those and really fix them, that's how you move the ball forward quicker than you think.
So before we wrap this up, I'll let anybody who's out there put a Q&A into the chat. So feel free. And then I will ask the three of you for maybe a parting thought on this. You know, in my head, when I think about HR, and I've had to realign my thoughts around HR, like you, Paul. But that, you know, when you really stop and think about what your largest line item typically is on your P&L, it's human capital. It's your people, right? And so having better strategies, practices, processes, accountability, and your largest investment is only a prudent business decision. That's the way I sort of see it. So I'll let, as we wait for see if some questions pop up, you know, Kimberly, I'm going to end with you since you're our special guest. So Reshma, I'll unfortunately start with you because I know you're sitting there like, don't start with me. But any
Totally was. I'm like, what am I going to say?
But I ladies first. I was trying to be polite, but no. Any parting words? You don't have to have any. Obviously, I'm just trying to see if there's any questions.
I think the purpose of this webinar was to talk about different HR strategies and how you should adjust as a business owner in this environment, in COVID, without COVID, again, with any of these pandemics or issues that come up. And I think that we covered some really good points. And I think what Kimberly said, it's really about, you know, accountability, and as a business owner and as a leader. And if you're accountable and you're very clear about what you want and what you want from your team and your employees, and it's clearly stated, I think a lot of your challenges, and I'm not trying to say HR has gone out the window, but you're following the rules, and then there's not going to be issues. And I think that's what's the key takeaway from this. And if it's not clearly stated, again, there's other things that come up as a CEO, but it's important to have that clear. If it's clear, you're going to avoid a lot of your issues going forward.
Awesome. Paul?
I feel we've said so many great things. I would just end with, don't be reactive with HR. Right? I think most scenarios, people tend to bring in legal and HR when you need it, and sometimes it's too late. And I'll just continue to echo those sentiments. Like, bring them in early, right? Sit down, worst case, strategize with them so you can figure out, hey, what risk am I potentially open to? And then as an owner, you made that decision, right? Do I want to take on that risk or not? So I would say that's the biggest thing. Be very proactive if possible, and figure out what's the timeline for you to implement their solutions, right? That's going to be your decision, but they can impact your bottom line, as you guys we've heard it, because it's dealing with people. If you can solve people issues, you can solve some of the business issues you come across.
Kimberly?
Sure. So I would say that no matter what the size of your organization is, you at some point need to have some HR guidance. 5 employees, 6 employees, it doesn't matter, because ultimately you're going to need policies, you're going to need some type of structure. And even if you don't need to hire an HR person, if you have 6 people, you may not need to hire an HR person. That's why people like me exist. But to just get some guidance, have someone lay eyes on policies and documents. If you have documents that you have people sign, please let somebody look at them. Please don't Google all of your things, because it can many times be challenging, because depending on the size of your organization, certain laws don't apply to you. So if you Google a handbook and you put something in there that doesn't apply to you, now you're responsible for it. Under 50, you don't need FMLA, but if you have a handbook with FMLA in it and you got 6 people, now you got to do FMLA. So just the quick have a conversation with someone, and whether you have an ongoing relationship with them or not, or you just say, hey, can you look at these things for me? I think it is important, and as you grow, it will be helpful, because it's easier to create these processes when you have 6 or 7 people than when you have 50 people, and then we have to go in and reconstruct things, clean things up, reclassify people, hope people don't say, oops, I should have got overtime for 3 years. Those types of things are a little bit more challenging to clean up. So that's what I would say. To Paul's point, don't wait on HR. You might not need to hire an HR person, but everyone needs to have a conversation with the HR person.
That's a really good point. Really good point. So we do have one question. And this one's for you, Kimberly. How often are handbooks updated?
Every legislative session. Maryland wrapped their legislative session last night, and I promise you, we will have some new policies in the next 90 days. So I would just say at least annually, because there's state and federal laws that we need to think about. Federal laws don't change as often, but state laws can change every session.
I don't think I realized that, actually. That was really good. I didn't even think about it, but that sounds terrible, actually. Every legislative.
And I'll also say that Maryland, which is where I am, is turning into baby California. So it's good for me because I get to advise people, but not so good for employers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any more questions. So Kimberly, thank you very much for your time today. Reshma, Paul, thank you again. Thank everybody. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for taking some time with us. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about one of us, please don't hesitate to connect with us on LinkedIn. I put it into the chat for everybody, or your preferred social media platform. Also, please check out Kimberly's podcast, HR and Cocktails. I put the link in the chat as well. And be on the lookout for part 2 of our series, our HR webinar series. In part 2, we're going to focus specifically on how diverse owners can build and maintain diverse workforces. I don't know if everyone gets it out there, but we sure do. We get the question of how diverse is our workforce as diverse owners. And so it's something we wanted to continue to talk about. So with that, have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. We hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
See ya.